The Roaring Twenties brought large-scale development of automobiles, aviation, telephones, movies, radio and electric power. Cars phased out horses, movies replaced live plays, radio brought entertainment into the living room, and electric appliances made life easier for families. Prohibition, outlawing the manufacture and selling of alcohol, came into effect at the beginning of the decade and met with mixed results. The decade was both the best of times and the worst of times. This is how Reedsburg lived through the 20s.
There were many changes and improvements to the city during the 1920s despite the loss of population. Reedsburg's population started the decade with 2,997 and ended in 1930 with 2,967, a loss of 30 people. This was the only decade in the city's history that experienced a reversal in growth. The intersection of the Baraboo River and Main Street became a very busy place during the summer of 1924. The antiquated and narrow steel span bridge was replaced. The old bridge had been built in 1885 at the location known as Babb's Ford, which was previously known as Indian Ford. It was to be replaced with a modern cement bridge that would be wide enough to accommodate automobiles as the country transitioned from horses as the main mode of transportation. It would also include sidewalks 6 feet wide on both sides of the bridge. Cost for the new bridge was just under $39,000. One of the old spans was bought by James Stone and moved upriver to the Maxim property. Stone, who lived on the west side, owned property on the north side of the river from the Maxim property, and the bridge would shorten his commute time to his farm. It also allowed people living on the northwest side of town to get to town quicker. The Appleton woolen mills used the same time to replace the dam and upgrade their power source in an effort to modernize the factory. The new dam was designed with a 10-foot head and expected to provide up to 250 horsepower. A new powerhouse was built to accommodate 2 vacuum-type turbines. This upgrade would more than double the factory's available electrical power.
A marker was placed near the southwest corner of the Main Street Bridge in 1928. It was a tribute to the first permanent white settler in Reedsburg, James Babb. Babb arrived in the spring of 1844. He crossed the Baraboo River at the spot known as Indian Ford. Within a short time, the river crossing became known as Babb's Ford. A bridge was built in 1849 for $75, which was replaced by a better bridge 4 years later at a cost of $300. The new bridge built in 1924 was the 5th one. The marker, a large granite stone with an aluminum plate attached to the stone with a brass frame, was placed by Babb's grandson, Maine Baker. The largest industry in Reedsburg during the 1920s was farming. More people worked in the production of food than any other business. While there were several factories dedicated to processing various foods produced on the farm, Reedsburg began transitioning to other products during the 20s. One of Reedsburg's largest factory employers was Nestlé's food company. They converted whole milk into condensed milk, which allowed them to sell milk anywhere in the world without spoilage. Sorg's Central Wisconsin Creamery Company made just over 1 million pounds of butter in 1921 along with 80,000 gallons of ice cream. They also shipped thousands of gallons of sweet cream to the city markets. The Reedsburg Canning Company was another buyer of raw products from farmers, both peas and sweet corn. While only a seasonal business, they produced 50,000 cases of peas and corn that were distributed in the Midwest. However, they suspended operations for the season in 1927. It was the first time this happened since they began operations in 1900. An oversupply of canned peas and corn on the market for the past 2 years had reduced demand for new goods and lowered prices. The local factory made the choice to suspend operations rather than reduce their acreage. They were betting that a reduction in the amount of goods put on the market would bring the price back up, so they might realize a more profitable margin once they started back up. Appleton Woolen Mills started up in 1876. By 1922, 100 people were employed there. They made all woolen products such as blankets, suits and specialty woolen items. In 1924, they built a new dam along with a powerhouse to accommodate 2 new, large turbines. The new turbines would allow them to modernize the plant by adding electric motors to replace much of the physical labor. The additional energy generators would allow the plant to motorize the entire plant. A bit of history was lost in the process though. Turns out that the bipolar generator that had become obsolete and no longer useful was destroyed in the process. 3 months later, the mill was contacted by a representative of Henry Ford. That's when the Woolen Mills learned that the generator they had replaced was one of the early machines built by the Thomas Edison Company in New Jersey. Ford was on a mission to find and collect all of the first electrical machines built by his good friend, Thomas Edison. The representative had traced the generator from the factory in New Jersey to Appleton and then to Reedsburg where the generator had been installed. The Reedsburg Roller Mills was considered one of the best appointed plants of its kind in the area. It was located across the river from the Woolen Mills and shared the power generated by the Woolen Mills Dam. They introduced a new hard winter flour in 1923. It was established as a high-grade product equal in quality and food value to any flour on the market. It was called Mother's Choice. The Reedsburg Broom Works closed in the early 20s but was revived in 1926 as the Reedsburg Broom Company. A former employee of the original factory was one of the principal owners. The 3 biggest additions to Main Street were the new Reedsburg Bank, the Chevrolet Agency and the Badger Theater. The corner building that previously was Tieman's drugstore had a fire in 1918 that made it necessary for Tiemann to move his store to a different location. He was able to secure the building 2 doors east. The burned building was torn down and became the site for the bank. The design of the building is a combination of Greek and Roman architecture. The outside of the building is Bedford stone from the quarries in Bedford, Indiana. There are 3 medallions over the windows on the west side of the building. These are in the stone frieze and are taken from 3 Greek coins. On the north end are the busts of the Dioscuri, in the center is King Agathocles and on the south end, the head of Ares. It opened for business in June, 1921. The American House Hotel on the corner of Main and North Water Street was torn down to make way for the Chevrolet Agency. A hotel named the Clark House was the first building erected on the site in 1849 but it burned down in 1877. The American House was built in 1877 out of brick to replace the Clark House. It fell into disrepair by 1918 and was finally replaced by the car dealer in 1928. Oscar Kelly was managing a theater on the northwest corner of Park and Main Street called the Majestic Theater. He decided to build his own theater. He found a spot, half a block to the east and on the other side of Main Street. He began construction on the Badger Theater in November, 1923. The new theater would be 132 feet long compared to 83 feet of the Majestic. Besides having the most modern facilities, it had seating for 400 as well as a 16 by 23-foot stage for shows and productions. The Badger Theater opened for business on the first Saturday in June, 1924. Meanwhile, Patrick Conley, owner of the Majestic Theater building, upgraded the projection equipment and improved the seating. He reopened the theater in May, 1925 to go into competition with his former manager. 3 years later, Around the time talking pictures began to appear, he closed the theater. He said he wanted to devote more time to his insurance business and wished continuous success to his competition. The Reedsburg Country Club was incorporated in the fall of 1924 once they decided to purchase 60 acres of the Roy Kinser Farm, 2 miles east of town on the north side of Highway 23. A landscape architect was hired from Madison and they designed the first 9-hole course. The original 39 members established membership with an initiation fee of $200 plus annual dues of $20. The course was open for play by August 1925. By September, the entire course was redesigned. Most of the holes and greens were shifted and permanent greens were installed. Fairways were disked and reseeded as well. The board began to see an increase in membership once they reduced the initiation fee. By May 1926, it was announced that a clubhouse would be built at the cost of $2,500. In addition to a large main room and kitchen, provisions were made for lockers and shower rooms. The clubhouse opened at the end of August and 100 people enjoyed a picnic supper before retiring to the clubhouse for dancing, cards and other entertainment. Aviation fever hit a new level during the summer of 1927 when Lindbergh landed in Paris. He was the first to fly non-stop from New York to Paris. Reedsburg resident John Hager was at the Paris airport the night Lindbergh arrived. He described the enthusiasm and celebratory mood of the very large crowd who went to the airport to welcome Lindy. The first commercial air flight to cross the Atlantic was the arrival of the Graf Zeppelin to Lakehurst, New Jersey. 40 crew members and 20 passengers crossed the Atlantic Ocean in 111 hours in October 1928. The ship also carried a large quantity of mail. One of the letters was addressed to Reedsburg druggist Henry Tiemann. His sister in Germany was the sender. The Reedsburg Chamber of Commerce leased 80 acres of land on the Seamandel farm at the east edge of town. Chamber members had been discussing the addition of an airport for several months and that it was time for Reedsburg to be added to the air route maps with a landing field. They were finally motivated into action when local mechanic, Cecil Hess bought a plane in March 1928. He bought a Waco 10 biplane for $2,500 and parked it in a hangar he built at the new airport. Cecil spent the next several years barnstorming around the countryside and giving rides for as much as $10, depending on the crowds. During a local airshow in July 1930, he carried a parachutist high above the crowd. She was 19-year-old May Rocks who billed herself as Peaches Lamar. She stepped off the wing, intending to thrill the spectators with a gentle descent to the ground. Sadly, her chute failed to open. From that tragedy, Cecil named his plane Miss Fortune. Cecil was not the first plane in the area though. Loganville native George Schlichtkow bought a plane in Chicago in June 1927. He kept the plane at his farm, using the fields as his runway. A second plane was added to the airport when a flying club was formed in 1928. The city purchased the airport land in May 1929 and began making improvements to the property. They also reported that planes flying between Chicago and the Twin Cities were stopping for fuel more and more often.
The 1920s was considered the golden age of radio. The formation of radio networks and expansion of broadcast stations brought entertainment into the living room. Broadcast history was made on January 4, 1928, when Reedsburg citizens, along with the rest of the country, got to experience the most remarkable radio program in history. It was the Dodge Brothers Victory 6 Radio Hour. It was also the costliest program ever produced. Will Rogers spoke in his usual conversational tone, giving the news of the day with his particular slant. Paul Whiteman's band played a selection of music, the Stones did a portion of their vaudeville act, and Al Jolson performed a song program. The engineers at American Telegraph and Telephone Company put together the plan that allowed the program to be aired across the United States at the same time. 3 AT&T transcontinental circuits were used to hook up 43 radio stations. The program went first to New York and then to the rest of the country. It required the skills of over 200 men and used 12,000 miles of telephone wire. Listeners sitting in their living rooms were able to spend the night together, listening to Will Rogers and Al Jolson cracking jokes on each other as the world got a little bit smaller that night.
The National Prohibition Act went into effect January 16, 1920, banning the sale and consumption of alcohol in the United States. The Reedsburg chapter of the Woman's Christian Temperance Union celebrated by holding a Jubilee reception at the Presbyterian Church with refreshments. That was the day Reedsburg taverns as well as the Reedsburg Brewery legally stopped selling beer, wine and liquor. Illegal sales and consumption became a different matter. Stills of all sizes began popping up around the county during the next 13 years. Dry agents spent that time hunting them down. The first major still, found in the county, was near Baraboo. Two brothers, Joe and Nick Medovich, were visited by two federal revenue agents one day in September 1920. When conducting a search of the farm, they found several jugs filled with bootleg whiskey. They carried several jugs to the car to be used as evidence, but Brother Joe had other ideas. He grabbed an axe and used it to smash the jugs. One of the agents ordered him to halt his actions. Joe turned and went towards the agent. Again, the agent told him to halt as he pulled out his revolver and fired 2 warning shots into the air. Joe continued towards the agent and was again ordered to stop. The moonshiner drew back with the axe and threw it at the agent just as the agent aimed his revolver towards his assailant and fired several shots. The axe just missed the agent's head, but the agent's bullets fired into Joe proved to be fatal. It turned out that the dead man was the same Joe Medovich that killed a man in Shullsburg several years earlier. He jumped bail and disappeared. Brother Nick was arrested and taken to jail. Several more stills were found in the county during the next 13 years. 2 of interest include the one found in May 1922. It was located on a farm owned by attorney James Stone, who had been appointed federal prohibition director for the state of Wisconsin. His farm was located just on the other side of the Juneau County line and was rented by Mike Schmidt, who was hauled off to jail. Stone resigned from his position at the end of the year. In March 1928, the largest still in Wisconsin was found by federal agents, 3 miles east of Reedsburg on Northwoods Road, just a few hundred yards from the main highway. This alcohol factory consisted of 3 stills with a capacity of 2,700 gallons, 9 immense storage tanks containing 6,900 gallons of mash, a generator to provide power and light, an oil burner that went through 150 gallons of crude oil per night, and miles of brass tubing and rubber hoses. All of this was situated within a 2-story barn on the Collins Dog Farm. On the day of the raid, there was 600 gallons of pure alcohol in containers, ready for shipment. The containers were destroyed by the 7 agents. The value of the factory was estimated to be at least $50,000. Due to the high value of the equipment, the feds figured the plant owners were based out of Chicago. Although they couldn't prove it, they knew Al Capone and other prominent gangsters were connected to the operation. Several men from Chicago had visited the area the previous fall, scouting for a good location. One of the scouts was reported to have been none other than Al Capone. 3 men from Kenosha were operating the still. They rented the barn from Dr. Sidney Collins the previous October, telling him they needed a storage location for their Chicago to Twin Cities transfer line. They also lived in the barn. Federal officers claimed they knew a large still was operating in this part of the state and the Collins farm was one of the possibilities. On the night before the raid, agents stopped a suspicious truck going through Baraboo at midnight. They found it loaded with 10,000 pounds of corn sugar. When they learned the destination of the truck, they used that information to stage their raid the next morning. The 3 still operators along with Dr. Collins were taken into custody and arraigned in Madison. Dr. Collins was found not guilty of conspiring to violate the prohibition laws. His 3 co-defendants pleaded guilty to charges of operating a still and were fined a total of $850. Multiple violations related to the prohibition law took place in town during the 13 years it was in effect. Whether they were making it, selling it or drinking it, it was a violation. Most of the time, a fine ranging from $50 to $1,000 was the penalty, but once in a while, jail time was imposed, depending on how many times the offender got caught. One local man was even arrested for making stills for others. Every now and then, there was the occasional strange incident. Take the case of John Zimmerman. While visiting Milwaukee in the spring of 1921, he lost his coat. It was found on a dock at the end of Chestnut Street, by the river. The Milwaukee police, thinking the worst, dragged the river for several days, looking for the body that belonged to the coat. When he woke up the next day, Zimmerman wondered what happened to his coat. He eventually learned of the mayhem caused by his carelessness. He composed a letter to the police department, apologizing for the grief he caused them. He said he had no intention of jumping into the river but that he did have a few belts of moonshine that day and lost his coat in the confusion of the day. One of Reedsburg's longtime residents, Frank Mackey, died on February 24, 1927 in his Minneapolis hotel. A funeral car brought him from Minneapolis for interment within the family mausoleum he built in 1919. Frank was born in Gilboa, New York on March 20, 1852. He moved to Reedsburg with his parents, Joseph and Cornelia, 2 years later. His father Joseph and Uncle Safford came to town with the intention of revitalizing a community that was dying due to setbacks experienced by the town's founder, David Reed. The 2 brothers bought the sawmill and gristmill and made them profitable. Joseph became involved in a multitude of ventures that helped grow the community. One of those ventures was the creation, along with David Rudd, of the first bank in town, the Reedsburg Bank. Frank worked in the bank as a cashier for several years. A story is told of how this young man had ambitions to go to California and make his fortune, so he gathered all his property in cash, some $5,000, and left to seek his fortune. In December 1875 he returned dead broke and was able to get his old job back as cashier. In 1879 the family moved to Minneapolis and from this time on, the fortunes came his way. He became the founder of several financial propositions which led to investments in many states as well as England and Mexico. His most successful venture came when he started the Household Finance Corporation in 1878. This was the first financial company to offer the installment plan for consumer loans rather than require a lump sum payment on the loan's due date. Today, the company has 58,000 employees in the United Kingdom, Canada, Argentina and America. These investments grew with amazing rapidity and he made millions. Mr. Mackey maintained a splendid home at Leamington, a fashionable summer resort in Warwickshire, England for many years. It was from the name of this town that he built and named the Leamington Hotel in Minneapolis. The hotel was erected in 1911 at a cost of more than $1 million. The Leamington Hotel was considered to be the finest hotel in the Twin Cities. Presidents Nixon, Eisenhower, Reagan, Johnson, and Senator Humphrey all stayed there when in town. The hotel was torn down in 1991 and replaced with a parking garage. Frank also maintained his childhood home in Reedsburg until his death. It was located on the northwest corner of Locust and Main Streets. Frank would spend a week or more there every summer. He also maintained several horses on the property so he could go riding during his visits. He was a great fancier of good horses and a renowned polo player. He was long known as one of the best polo players in England. He was one of the players of the Foxhunters Hurlingham Polo Club. They played at the 1900 Olympics in Paris and won the gold medal. It was the first time polo was played in the Olympics. The Wisconsin Firemen's Association 37th Annual Gathering was hosted by Reedsburg in 1924. 2,500 firemen from all around the state converged on Reedsburg for their convention and tournament. Firemen were hosted by locals in their homes during the event. They began arriving in town on Wednesday afternoon and were ready for the parade Thursday morning. The parade with 30 organizations comprising 700 firemen got underway at 10 a.m. 9 bands furnished music for the march as they paraded in regular Army style. 10 fire trucks brought up the rear of the parade. Thousands of spectators lined the parade route, which went up Pine Street to 8th Street, back down Park Street and through the downtown area. The contests took place at the ball field where 3,500 spectators enjoyed the rivalries. Several thousand others remained in the downtown area, enjoying the atmosphere and listening to the musical performances offered throughout the day by the different bands. The evening ended with a dance. Friday morning closing events consisted of water fights in the morning and a baseball game in the afternoon. 4 years later, in 1928, Reedsburg won their third first-place trophy. Time rarely stands still, but it did for Albert Powell. He bought a 17-jewel Waltham timepiece in 1900 when he was 18 years old. It became his proudest possession. 9 years later, he was living in Milwaukee while attending a school for the blind. He needed a new suit of clothes. He hit upon the idea of raffling off his watch. He sold chances for 25 cents apiece and had no problem selling 100 tickets. August Unruh won the raffle and took possession of the watch. August was a blacksmith at the time and after several years, went into the blacksmith supply business. He began calling on blacksmith shops around the state. He was in a Reedsburg blacksmith shop in 1927 when Albert walked into the shop. Albert had returned to Reedsburg following his school where he learned how to weave wicker baskets. He set up a shop downtown and did a brisk business. Baskets were a high-demand item at the time. When Albert walked into the shop, August recognized him immediately. He reminded Albert that he was the one who won the raffle for his watch 18 years earlier. Albert asked him if he could buy the watch back. The answer was yes. Albert offered $25, the amount he received in the raffle, but August maintained he would only accept the amount he paid for it, 25 cents. The deal was closed and the watch was returned to its first and original owner. More tourists were popping up on the landscape thanks to the automobile, and Reedsburg opened her arms to this growing industry. The city started paying more attention to South Park for use by locals for afternoon picnics and evening gatherings. More trees were planted on the grounds, low spots were drained and a shelter was erected as well as bathrooms. The park also became the local camping grounds for people traveling through town. The park also featured a pond that was fed by a free-flowing well, bubbling up the best-tasting water in town. Travelers from all around the country would stop in after learning about the location by word of mouth from other travelers. The Baraboo River also became a tourist attraction. As many as a dozen boats became available for hire to ferry passengers upriver. These boats launched from the north side of the bridge. Several landowners along the river built cottages that could be rented for overnight stays and daytime parties. The best way to get to them was by boat, along the river.